March 1, 1942. The Java Sea, northwest of WWII Island. The heavy cruiser Exeter is making 23 knots, and that is everything she can give. In her boiler rooms, men are working knee-deep in hot water because half her boilers were smashed 2 days earlier. Captain Oliver Gordon stands on the bridge and watches the horizon to the south, where two silhouettes are rising. In a minute, he will understand they are Japanese heavy cruisers. A minute after that, he will see two more closing from the northwest. The ship that entered legend 2 years before for forcing the enemy to divide his fire was now divided herself. From two sides, 4 heavy cruisers against one, crippled and slow. Of 630 men aboard, relatively few would die that day. Japanese shells would kill about 60. And then came the part the victory newsreels never show.
Around 650 men would be pulled from the water alive by the Japanese, carried off to camps, and roughly 152 of them would die there of starvation, disease, and beatings. They survived the battle. They survived the sinking. What killed them was what came after. The official memory of Exeter ends off the coast of Uruguay in December of '39, where she helped finish off the German raider Admiral Graf Spee. Everyone knows that version. The triumph of 3 cruisers over a pocket battleship, the first British naval victory of the Second World War, the headlines, the newsreels, the 1956 film in which Exeter plays herself. The real version runs longer, and it is about what happened to the same ship afterward. Not the parade version, the real one. Because the tactic that brought Exeter her fame at the River Plate was worked out by one man at a desk in Greenwich 5 years before the war. It worked perfectly against one opponent. And 2 years later, that same logic, turned inside out by other hands, pinned the ship against the water and would not let go. And the captain who led a handful of survivors out of that battle would sit down, after 3.5 years in Japanese captivity, and write a book about the death of his ship. He would give it a 2-word title, the same 2 words that ended the order which doomed Exeter. But we will come back to that. To understand why Exeter ended up alone against 4, you have to understand what she was and what she was not. In the late 1920s, the British Admiralty was bound hand and foot by the Washington Naval Treaty. A heavy cruiser under the treaty could carry no more than 8 inches of main gun and could not exceed 10,000 tons. Britain needed many cruisers to protect the longest trade network in the world, and every ton spent on one ship meant one ship fewer somewhere else. Out of that arithmetic came Exeter. She was laid down at Devonport Dockyard on the 1st of August, 1928. Launched a year later, commissioned in July of '31. She was the last heavy cruiser the Royal Navy would ever build. She was smaller than her sisters in class. Standard displacement 8,390 tons, nearly 2,000 below the treaty ceiling. The designers saved weight by removing one gun turret. Instead of 8 8-inch guns, like the larger county-class cruisers, Exeter carried 6 in 3 twin turrets. The logic was simple. A smaller ship meant more ships could be built under the same treaty limit. 6 8-inch guns instead of 8, a shorter hull, less armor in some places. That decision saved weight and money. It also meant that in any serious fight, Exeter would be outgunned by almost every heavy cruiser in the world. The Japanese heavy cruisers she was about to meet carried 10 8-inch guns each. Her armor belt was 3 inches thick.
76 millimeters of steel along the waterline, covering the engine and boiler rooms. Over the magazines, the belt thickened to 5 inches, because a magazine detonation meant the instant death of the entire ship. The main gun turrets were protected by just 1 inch of armor, 25 millimeters, thinner than on some light cruisers. Any large splinter, any near miss, could put a turret out of action, and the men inside it with it. At the River Plate, a German shell did exactly that, and the crew of the forward turret ceased to exist in a fraction of a second. Inside a hull 175 meters long, around 630 men lived and worked. 8 Admiralty boilers drove steam to 4 turbines. The turbines turned 4 shafts, and on trials, the ship made 32 knots. Those 32 knots were her main advantage: speed.
The cruiser could not outshoot a heavier opponent, but she could dictate range, she could run, she could chase down a merchant raider. In a world where Exeter was built to hunt lone German raiders in the Atlantic, speed mattered more than armor. Her range was about 10,000 nautical miles at 14 knots, enough to patrol the empty stretches of the South Atlantic for weeks. The boiler rooms were hell, even in peacetime. The temperature at the furnaces climbed past 50 degrees. Stokers and engine room men stood watch in that heat for 4 hours, breathing air thick with the smell of hot oil and metal. When the ship ran at full speed, the roar of the turbines and the fans drowned out voices, and orders were passed by hand signals or shouted into voice pipes. These same spaces, behind 3 inches of belt, would become the place where the ship's fate was decided. 3 times a shell would find Exeter's boilers, once at the River Plate, once in the first battle off Java, and once in the last. The first 2 times the ship would survive, the 3rd time she would not. Exeter had something most British cruisers of the early war did not. After the refit that followed the River Plate, the ship was almost completely rearmed and fitted with radar. The technology that was supposed to give her eyes in darkness and fog an advantage over the enemy. By the spring of '42, that advantage meant nothing. The radar saw the approaching Japanese cruisers perfectly. It simply could not change the fact that there were 4 of them, and Exeter was one, damaged and slow. Sometimes, better technology only lets a crew see more clearly that there is no way out. The ship was cramped. Not the way a submarine is, but enough that 630 men constantly shared the same air, the same narrow passages, the same heads. On a York-class cruiser, the living decks lay under the armored deck, below the waterline, forward and aft. Sailors slept in hammocks, slung at night and rolled up in the morning. A hammock was hung wherever there was room, over a mess table, in a passage, against a bulkhead behind which the machinery roared. There was no private space for anyone below officer rank. One of these men left a description of how he came aboard. In February of '41, as a young stoker, he joined Exeter, already famous for her part at the River Plate. First came working up trials near the Denmark Strait, with one eye on the German battleship Bismarck, which everyone was hunting then. Then convoy after convoy, the Cape of Good Hope, Aden, Durban, Colombo, Bombay, Calcutta. On the 7th of December '41, the day the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, his ship was off the coast of Burma with a troop convoy bound for Rangoon. For a stoker deep inside Exeter, the war was at first the heat of the furnaces and the monotony of convoy duty, not a battle. The routine was built around watches.
4 hours on station, 8 hours off, around and around, day after day. On paper, that gave a man enough sleep. In practice, the 8-hour stretch was eaten up by meals, equipment maintenance, drills, cleaning, and 100 small shipboard chores that never stopped. In quiet steaming, a sailor could count on about 5 hours of real sleep. In action, when the ship was closing to intercept or running from an enemy, action stations was sounded, and then men stood at their guns and machinery for many hours at a stretch, without relief until the situation resolved itself one way or another. Food depended on where the ship was and how long she had been at sea. In the tropical waters of the East Indies, where Exeter was sent in late '41, fresh provisions ran out within days of leaving port. After that came tinned food, biscuit, salt beef. The galley fed 630 men from equipment built to the bare minimum. Drinking water was rationed because the evaporators produced a limited amount, and in the heat of the equator, a man lost moisture fast. The heat was an enemy of its own. Exeter was designed for the North Atlantic, for cold water and gray sky. She had essentially no cooling systems for the tropics. In the Java Sea, where the water temperature rose toward 30 degrees and the humidity held at its limit, the interior spaces turned into an oven. Below the waterline, in the boiler and engine rooms where the furnaces burned, the temperature passed 50. Men collapsed from heat stroke. Salt tablets were handed out to replace what the body sweated away. Sleeping in that heat, in the stale air of the living deck, was almost impossible, and many dragged their hammocks topside, under the open sky, when conditions allowed. Among the crew was a Canadian, able seaman Ray Fitchett, who had crossed an ocean to volunteer for the Royal Navy.
Decades later, his grandson would preserve a recording of his account of abandoning the sinking ship in shark-infested water of more than 3 years in Japanese captivity. In February of '42, Fitchett was one of the 630, a nameless number on a roster. A year later, his family at home would not know whether he was alive or dead until an official telegram arrived saying he was a prisoner of the Japanese. The medicine aboard the cruiser rested on the ship's surgeon and a few sick berth attendants. The sick bay was built for everyday injuries and illness, not for the mass casualties of battle. When a shell struck a crowded compartment, there were more wounded than there were hands to help. The surgeon decided whom he could save and whom he could not, and worked as long as he could stay on his feet. At the River Plate, Exeter's surgeon operated while the ship listed and burned around him. His son would tell a newspaper decades later that his father survived by clinging to wreckage and then spent 4 years in Japanese captivity on the railways of Java. That detail, one man passing through both hells, the battle and the captivity, would repeat itself in the fate of hundreds of his shipmates. On the 10th of December, '41, Exeter came into Singapore. That same day, Japanese aircraft sank the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse off the coast of Malaya. 2 heavy ships, the pride of the British fleet, gone to the bottom in a matter of hours under bombs and aerial torpedoes. Exeter's crew did not just hear about it. That night, they met the survivors with their own hands, fed them and clothed them in a warehouse by the quay where their cruiser lay. The young stoker who left his memoir was among those who did it. They looked into the faces of men whose unsinkable ships had just gone to the bottom in a single day, and they understood what kind of war they were in. The old world, where a heavy ship was master of the sea, had ended before their eyes. But neither the heat, nor the sleeplessness, nor the tinned food, nor even the fear of Japanese aircraft was what would in the end kill most of them. To understand what doomed Exeter, you have to go back 8 years, to a lecture hall at the Naval College in Greenwich. Between 1934 and '36, a tactics instructor taught there, an officer named Henry Harwood. A torpedo specialist who had come through the First World War, he was lecturing at the moment British naval thinking was being rebuilt. A new type of German ship had appeared, the so-called pocket battleship, the Panzerschiff, a cruiser's displacement but a battleship's guns, 11 inches of main armament. Such a ship could outshoot any British cruiser from a range at which it stayed untouchable itself. Harwood worked on the problem of how a group of cruisers could defeat an opponent that hit farther and harder than any one of them alone. The solution he arrived at was elegant. The cruisers were to split, to operate in separated divisions, closing on the enemy from different directions instead of in a single line. Then the enemy, with his heavy but few guns, was forced to choose. Either he concentrated his fire on one division and left the other to fire unanswered, or he split his salvos between targets and lost accuracy on each. Either way, the pocket battleship's one advantage, its long-range power, was diluted. Harwood put it as an order for his commanders. With 3 cruisers in company against 1 pocket battleship, attack at once, by day or by night. On the 13th of December '39, that theory met reality off the mouth of the River Plate. Exeter went at the Admiral Graf Spee from one side, the light cruisers Ajax and Achilles from the other. The German commander, Hans Langsdorff, did exactly what Harwood had feared. He concentrated his main guns on the most dangerous target, Exeter with her 8-inch guns, and scattered his secondary armament onto the light cruisers. Exeter took the main blow. 7 hits from 11-inch shells, 2 of her 3 turrets knocked out, 61 men killed, 23 wounded, the ship burning and listing. But while the Spee was smashing Exeter, Ajax and Achilles fired on the German unanswered, and one of Exeter's shells wrecked the plant that purified the Spee's fuel. Without it, the raider could not reach Germany.
Langsdorff took his ship into neutral Montevideo and scuttled her himself a few days later. The doctrine worked. Dividing the fire turned a hopeless matchup into a strategic victory. Exeter came home a hero. More than a year in repair, new guns, new radar, and the fame of the ship that helped sink the first major German raider of the war. And here the usual logic of a story like this turns over. The pattern of these accounts almost always rests on a miscalculation by the enemy. One side underestimated something and paid for it. With Exeter, it runs differently. Off Java, the enemy miscalculated nothing. What miscalculated was the very system that sent the ship out to fight. And the first of its miscalculations was called ABDA. In February of 42, Exeter found herself under ABDA command. The abbreviation stood for the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, and behind those four letters stood a hastily stitched-together coalition trying to hold the Dutch East Indies against a Japanese invasion. Ships from four navies that had never sailed together, speaking two different languages, with no common codebooks, no common signal tables, no practice working as one. The problem was not abstract. The Dutch Admiral Karel Doorman, commanding the combined squadron, physically could not give an order directly. He signaled by light or by flag in Dutch. A liaison officer on the American cruiser Houston translated it into English, and from there the orders went out by radio to the other ships. Every order passed through an extra link, losing seconds that battle never has to spare. And when the muzzle blast of Doorman's own guns aboard his flagship De Ruyter shattered his signal lamps, control of the squadron nearly collapsed. If this account is worth your time, subscribing helps the channel not lose the next one. On the 27th of February, that mismatched squadron put to sea to intercept a Japanese convoy and ran into the First Battle of the Java Sea. It was the largest surface action since Jutland. The Allies had 2 heavy cruisers, Houston and Exeter, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Japanese, covering the landings, had heavy and light cruisers and 14 destroyers, armed with torpedoes whose range the Allies did not even suspect. The battle ran for 7 hours. Exeter took an 8-inch shell in a boiler room. Her speed collapsed, and the ship, wreathed in steam, fell out of line and limped to Surabaya under cover of a Dutch destroyer. That same night, the Japanese tore Doorman's squadron apart. The admiral himself went down with his flagship De Ruyter, struck by a torpedo fired from a range the Allies had thought impossible. 5 Allied ships and more than 1,000 men were left in the Java Sea. And here the system made the decision that doomed Exeter. The ship was damaged, slow, able to make 18 knots at most. She had to be brought out of doomed Java to Ceylon for repair. But her draft was too great for the southern, less obvious exit from Surabaya harbor. That meant Exeter had to be taken out through the main northern channel, straight into the Java Sea, which by then was swarming with Japanese warships. On the evening of the 28th of February, Exeter sailed from Surabaya escorted by the British destroyer Encounter and the American destroyer Pope. 1 heavy cruiser barely holding her speed and 2 destroyers. They were sent to pass through a sea controlled by an enemy with overwhelming superiority in ships. This was not a sortie to fight. It was an attempt to slip through. And it very nearly worked. 1 ship had survived the River Plate, a year of repair, and the First Battle of the Java Sea. And she was destroyed by the same logic of division that had once made her famous. On the 1st of March, at 4 in the morning, Exeter's lookouts sighted ships to the west. Gordon, knowing his cruiser was in no state to fight, turned away to the northwest to avoid contact. The 3 ships were making 23 knots, the most Exeter could give after her boilers were patched in haste at Surabaya. At 7:50, masts on the horizon again, this time to the southwest. Another turn away. The sea around them was full of Japanese, and the 3 Allied ships weaved between enemy groups, trying to find a clear corridor to the Sunda Strait, which they hoped was still open. At 9:35, 2 heavy cruisers appeared from the south, Nachi and Haguro, the same ships that had finished off Doorman's squadron 2 days earlier under Admiral Takagi. Gordon turned to the northeast and ordered more speed, squeezing from the broken boilers everything they could give. And almost at once, ahead of them, to the northwest, two more silhouettes rose: Ashigara and Miyoko, under Admiral Takahashi. 4 Japanese heavy cruisers, 8 and even 10 8-inch guns on each, closing on Exeter from 2 sides, snapping the pincers shut. More than 30 main guns against 6. The picture was a mirror image of the River Plate, turned against the British. Then 3 British ships had spread out so the enemy could not concentrate his fire. Now the Japanese spread out so that Exeter could not run in any one direction without exposing herself to the other group. The same geometry, the same logic of division. Only this time what was divided was not the enemy's fire, but the routes of escape. And at the center of the figure was one crippled cruiser. Encounter and Pope did the little they could. They laid a smokescreen, shielding Exeter, and ran in to make a torpedo attack, trying to force the heavy Japanese cruisers to turn away. 2 small destroyers against 4 cruisers. The Japanese opened fire at about 19,000 yards and began closing the range. For nearly 2 hours, the gun battle ran at extreme range, both sides missing again and again in the roll in the distance, columns of water rising around the ships from near misses.
For a while it seemed Exeter might get away again, the way she had cheated death at the River Plate. And then it ended quickly. At around 11:20, an 8-inch shell entered Exeter's boiler room. The same place behind 3 inches of armor. The same place a shell had found at the River Plate, and found again 2 days earlier in the first battle. The boilers stopped. The steam fell away. Power across the whole ship died at once. The main gun turrets, robbed of their electric drive, fell silent one after another. A ship with no way on and no power had become a stationary target. Gordon gave the order to scuttle the ship and abandon her, so she would not fall into enemy hands. Demolition charges were set in the hold. And here begins the part that usually stays off camera in accounts of sea battles. The men carrying out the damage assessment in the lower compartments did it in the dark, because the bulbs had shattered and the emergency lighting could not cope. They felt their way along the healing passages, finding the wounded and hauling them up toward the light, up ladders that were already sliding out from under them. Stokers and engine room men climbed out of boiler rooms where the steam pipes had just burst, past those who had not been lucky enough to be farther from the rupture. On the upper deck, men threw overboard anything that would float and jumped from the leaning side into the Java Sea, into water everyone already knew held sharks. About 1,100 men ended up over the side, on rafts, in nets, clinging to wreckage. The Japanese destroyer Inazuma put 2 torpedoes into the dying cruiser. Exeter, already heeling to port, shuddered from the hit to starboard, righted herself for a moment, and then rolled over the other way. Around noon she went under, her battle ensigns still flying from the masts. Encounter the Japanese sank in the same battle, in a 40-minute last stand of a small destroyer against heavy cruisers. Pope managed to break away under cover of a rain squall, held out a few hours, and was finished off by Japanese aircraft in the afternoon. Of the 3 ships that had sailed from Surabaya on the evening of the 28th of February, not one survived to the night of the 1st of March. Some of the survivors, about 400 men, were picked up by Japanese destroyers an hour after Exeter went down. The rest spent nearly a full day in the open water of the Java Sea before a Japanese ship took them aboard. Among those who clung to wreckage for nearly a day was Captain Gordon. The Japanese off Java made no mistake. That is the turn of this story. Admirals Takagi and Takahashi did to Exeter exactly what needed to be done. They enveloped her, divided her routes, took away her maneuver, and finished her. The miscalculation was on the other side. What miscalculated was the system that sent the ship into that matchup. The ABDA command was doomed from the start. A coalition with no common language, no common signals, no practice together, thrown in to defend territory that could no longer be held. The command structure itself fell apart within weeks. Singapore fell on the 15th of February, and the British lost their reason to hold to a joint defense. Command was handed to the Dutch on the 25th of February, 2 days before the first battle. Exeter was a heavy ship, whose one advantage, speed, was taken away by hits to her boilers.
Her draft would not let her into the safe southern channel. She was sent to slip through a sea ruled by an enemy with a fourfold superiority in heavy ships. The decision to take Exeter out that way was not one man's stupidity. It was the logic of a hopeless position the fleet had backed itself into, stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific thinner than it could bear. And here the real cost shows itself.
Of the roughly 650 men of the crew the Japanese pulled from the water alive, around 152 never came home. The ship was killed by shells. These men were killed by what came after the battle. They were taken to a camp near Makassar on the island of Celebes. The ration was watery rice stew, now and then with vegetables, often rotten. Red Cross parcels never reached the prisoners. The guards stole them. There was no medicine, and prisoner doctors made splints out of bamboo and tools out of tin cans. Tropical diseases, dysentery, malaria, ulcers, killed faster than any shell. Some of the prisoners were later shipped out to work in the docks and coal mines around Nagasaki. They had survived 4 hits at the River Plate. They had survived 2 battles in the Java Sea. They had survived the sinking and a day in the open water. And then the system of the camps killed them slowly. 3.5 years, 1 and 2 a day.
One of them, Petty Officer George Castro, a father of 2, pulled from the Java Sea that day in March, lasted in the camp more than 3 years, and died of starvation on the 31st of May, 1945. Less than 3 months before Japan surrendered. He survived everything but the final weeks. The battle lasted 1 morning. The dying lasted years. Captain Oliver Loudon Gordon spent nearly a full day in the water before a Japanese ship picked him up. He was 46 years old. He was born on Antigua in the 1890s, entered the Royal Navy as a cadet in 1909, came up through the whole career to command of Exeter, which he took on the 11th of March, 41. His elder brother James had been killed in the First World War. Oliver himself had served as navigating officer on the royal yacht, had commanded ships, had worn an order of chivalry.
And on the 1st of March, 42, he watched his cruiser go down after giving the order to scuttle her himself. Then came 3.5 years of captivity, Zentsuji camp on the island of Shikoku, then a transfer to Mitsushima in the mountains. Gordon was freed on the 4th of September, 1945, after Japan surrendered. He returned to service, commanded the cruiser Cleopatra, was made a companion of the Order of the Bath in 48, served as aide-de-camp to King George VI, and in 57 he sat down and wrote a book about what he had been through. The first full account of the loss of Exeter written by a Briton who was there. He gave it a 2-word title, Fight It Out. These were words out of the British naval tradition, out of the very spirit of the doctrine that made his ship famous at the River Plate and doomed her off Java. The order to fight against superior force, not to retreat, to force the action. At the River Plate, that order brought victory. Off Java, it meant that 1 crippled cruiser would be sent to die against 4, and it would be called valor, though behind the word stood a hopeless end. The Admiralty would later officially judge the battle off Java worthy of a battle honor, as, and this is the quote, an exceptional case of outstanding efforts against overwhelming odds. Gordon was made a companion of the Order of the Bath in the same list of awards that came out only in January of 46, when the survivors finally came home and could tell what had happened. Gordon died in 1973, having lived long enough to see his ship play herself in a film, to see the story turned into a triumph. He knew both versions, the one off Uruguay and the one off Bawean. He gave his book the title of the order that killed his ship, and spent the rest of his life explaining what that order cost the men inside the machine.
The ship that became a legend for forcing the enemy to divide his fire died because the enemy divided her line. And the order that made her a legend turned out to be the same order that sent her to the bottom. If this account was worth your time, like and subscribe. That is how the channel grows and how the next stories get made.